Of all the balance patches in 2018, the December balance patch easily has the most dramatic effect, at least as far as Necromancer is concerned. To begin, I'll start with the most dramatic changes of the lot, which are the changes to Soul Reaping. All of the Soul Reaping minor traits were changed in addition to every single master trait in Soul Reaping. What these changes essentially amounted to was the elimination of our minor master trait, the elimination of the spectral major master trait, the movement of the cooldown reduction from a major master trait to the minor master trait, and the movement of a 10% damage modifier from the minor grandmaster to a major master trait. For power necros using the Soul Reaping trait line, this is just a straight up nerf. You can no longer get all of the effects you were previously able to. For example, you used to be able to get both the defensive value from the last gas miner, the Shroud cooldown reduction, 180 vitality bonus, and the 10% damage modifier, all on the same build. You can't do that anymore. While you do get the Shroud cooldown reduction as a minor now, which means you can pick whatever Master Major you want, you've lost last gasp for that, so you've completely lost the defensive value there. Also, if you want to get the 10% damage modifier, you have to select that over Vital Persistence, so you're not going to be getting that Vitality bonus anymore. For Spectral builds, it's even worse, as the Spectral Mastery trait just straight up doesn't exist anymore, so yeah, they're just kind of hung out to dry. Although some of the lesser used Spectral traits were given pretty substantial buffs. We'll talk about that in a minute. There is a silver lining here, though. The movement of the Shroud skill cooldown reduction to the minor trait is something that honestly should have happened ages ago, and is good to see it finally happen now, as this does really open up the master tier traits. As previously, if you weren't running a Spectral build, you just always ran Vital Persistence. Additionally, Gluttony saw some positive changes. It no longer has its might generating mechanic, which was, to be quite honest, very clunky to deal with and wasn't actually that strong. And instead, it was changed to applying its Life Force bonus to all sources of Life Force, as the old version of the trait only gave the Life Force increase bonus to Life Force gained from skills. This means Gluttony now affects the traits Unholy Martyr, Soul Marks, Chilling Victory, Blighter's Boon, Soul Eater, and Nourishing Ashes. They also gave pretty substantial buffs to the Fear of Death trait. The old version gave you 50% fear duration. The new version gives you 100% fear duration. Additionally, it now grants 15% life force when you apply fear to a foe. This is really strong. This is a little less useful for a power necro that would likely want to take the 10% damage modifier in the new Soul Barbs trait, but for a Condi necro, particularly Condi Scourge, this is an extremely useful addition. For Condi Scourge, it means that their Staff 5 and their number 4 Shade skill now give them 15% life force. This doesn't seem like a lot since there's only 2 skills, but in practice this is extremely noticeable. When I played around with it, I had not only no issues with life force generation, but I actually found it nearly impossible to run out of life force on Scourge when running this trait, because it's so much life force just from those 2 skills. Additionally, you can get it from corrupting stability into fear. I even, just for the sake of trying to run out of life force with this trait, actually ran a 0 vitality build on Scourge using a rabbit amulet, and I still couldn't run out of life force. You just can't run out of life force with this trait, particularly if it's combined with the Nourishing Ashes trait in the Scourge trait line. So for Scourge at least, this is a huge bonus. Additionally, if you're not too worried about your life force management, a Condi Necro or Scourge may choose to take the new Vital Persistence trait, which gives a vitality bonus and gives a 10% bonus to incoming healing. This is really useful if you're paired off with a support such as a Firebrand. However, I can't help but think that the healing bonus was something that was just tacked in there because the developers didn't know what else to put in there to fill the void left by the cooldown reduction that they had moved to the minor trait. Now let's talk about Soul Barbs. That's the brand new trait that's replacing the old Spectral Mastery trait. This trait gives a 10% damage bonus when you enter Shroud, and that damage bonus lasts for 10 seconds, and it also gives the same bonus for 10 seconds when you exit Shroud. Now, this is not a new 10% multiplier. This is the same 10% damage bonus that used to be in the Grandmaster Minor trait. However, they removed it from that trait and made it into a major trait. However, there is one change, and that is how you get this damage bonus. You see, the old 10% damage mod that existed in the minor only applied while you were above 50% life force. In PvE, that didn't really matter, because in PvE, life force management is easy. However, in PvP, where you're often well below 50% life force, if not completely out of life force, the old damage modifier was rather hit or miss. However, the new version, while it is somewhat unfortunate that we don't get this as a free minor, it does give you the damage mod when you enter and exit Shroud, which is much more reliable and consistent. In other words, it's not giving you any more damage, but it is a quality of life increase. However, I will notice there is a downside to this new functionality. You see, this damage modifier, when you get it has a status effect, a icon that shows up on your bar. While this is useful in that you can look at your bar and tell whether you've got the damage modifier, it means the enemy can look at your bar and tell if you've got that damage modifier. And this is really important because this damage modifier lasts for 10 seconds. And it applies when you exit Shroud, in addition to when you enter it. This is important because Shroud has a 10-second cooldown, which means the trait, Soul Barbs, can be used to tell if an opposing Necromancer has his Shroud off cooldown yet. In other words, if you're looking at a Necromancer who is out of Shroud, and you see that black star on a green background icon on their bar, you know they don't have Shroud back yet. If it's not on their bar, then you know they do have Shroud. Now, how practical that knowledge is, debatable, but it is information that you could potentially use against the Necromancer that is using this trait. Overall, the various changes to Soul Reaping are, as I've already mentioned, a flat nerf, at least as far as Power Necro is concerned. However, many of the changes, such as Gluttony and Soul Barbs, are quality of life improvements. I would say that while the raw power level and the effectiveness you get out of the trait line is down, it is better designed than it was before. Unfortunately, since we're in a meta where Power Necro isn't exactly a dominant class, it's also difficult to justify why on earth we had a raw effectiveness decrease after this patch. Moving on beyond Soul Reaping, let's talk about the spectral changes. The spectral skills were given buffs to compensate for the fact that Spectral Mastery is no longer a trait that you can get. However, they didn't actually apply buffs to all of the spectral skills. Spectral Armor and Spectral Grasp did not get buffs, which means if you were running those skills with Spectral Mastery, those skills were effectively nerfed. Spectral Grasp, on the other hand, wasn't used so much like Spectral Armor, but at the same time, Spectral Grasp never really got much out of the Spectral trait. The 5% life force that the Spectral trait gave to Spectral skills doesn't really matter much for Spectral Grasp once you consider the enormousness that is Spectral Grasp's 15% life force per target struck. And the duration increase to Spectral skills given by the Spectral Mastery trait likewise doesn't mean much to Spectral Grasp. It only applied to the chill applied by Spectral Grasp, which doesn't really matter much in the long run. Spectral Wall and Spectral Walk, however, did see buffs. Spectral Wall was turned into Spectral Ring because it now creates a ring instead of a wall. This is a much more useful shape. If you drop it on top of someone's head, they can't just walk around it like they could before. Although ArenaNet did add an ICD, which kind of kills some of the value of the buff, but it's still, I would say, a buff. However, it's also still a skill that I would not consider worth the slot. It's just not useful enough for us. Spectral Walk, on the other hand, did see some substantial bonuses that actually I think could make it strong enough to be worth a slot. Previously, Spectral Walk only really was functional for a stun break and a mobility juke via the teleport. The new version, however, it works a bit differently. Previously, it gave you 3% life force when you were struck while using the skill, which just was kind of a worse version of Spectral Armor. The new version clears a condition every 2 seconds while the skill is active, and when it clears a condition, it gives you 4% life force. This is really useful because it means you can now use Spectral Walk as a condition management skill. You could run a build with just consume conditions and Spectral Walk, and that would be more than enough Condi clear to deal with pretty much every reasonable PvP situation. In the past, when you didn't have Condi clear on Spectral Walk, that meant you would have to take another utility skill for that extra Condi clear. You don't have to do that anymore, which improves the value of Spectral Walk. In fact, I'll probably do a number of builds using Spectral Walk because it is a lot more interesting to play with now. Also, Lich Form had its cooldown reduced from 180 to 150 seconds. Still never going to take Lich Form. Moving on, the trait in Death Magic called Reaper's Protection was removed and replaced with a new trait called Dark Defiance, which causes you to gain 3 seconds of protection when you're hit with a CC and cause protection that is applied to you to reduce the incoming condition damage by 20%. This is a much better trait than the old Reaper's Protection, which was a completely and utterly useless trait. In fact, the new trait's a really interesting trait to play with. It gives you protection when you're CC'd, which is something that Necromancer could really benefit from, given how frequently we get CC'd. And the fact that it's giving 20% damage reduction to conditions while we have protection is also useful, particularly once you consider there's another trait in Death Magic that also allows you to get 20% damage reduction against conditions. Which means you could run a potential build with both traits that is designed around managing conditions, not by cleansing them, but by just tanking them. However, for such a build to ever be viable, it would require some other changes being made to Death Magic to make the trait line not garbage. Although, at least this change to Reaper's Protection is a step in the right direction with regards of making the trait line not garbage. Moving on, let's talk about probably what is the heaviest nerf to Necromancer in this entire patch, which is they took every single offensive proc on Necromancer and removed its ability to crit. This is Chill of Death, Chilling Nova, Weakening Shroud, and Spiteful Spirit. None of these can crit anymore. This is a pretty heavy-handed damage nerf, and once you consider that all of those traits except for Weakening Shroud and Chilling Nova were given pretty heavy nerfs in the past, means that none of these procs hit for any significant amount of damage. Spiteful Spirit, for example, only hits for about 500 damage tops nowadays, and Weakening Shroud hits less than Retail does. Essentially, these procs are only usable for their utility function, not for their damage function. This is pretty nasty. Since Necromancer as a class has probably some of the longest cast times and biggest animation telegraphs of any class in the game, we often depend on these offensive procs to give us the quick instant damage necessary to bring down highly evasive foes. For example, I use Spiteful Spirit as my bread and butter when it comes to fighting thieves and mesmers, because I can use Shroud Entry and the instantaneous Spiteful Spirit hit to apply pressure to them in between the small gaps in their evade frames. You can't do that anymore, or well, you still can, it's just the damage is pretty much non-existent. I cannot overstate how noticeable this is. I pretty much, in the very first fight I got into after these changes, I immediately noticed how bad the damage was. And this isn't something new. I mean, they nerfed the damage of all these traits in the last patch, and now they're removing the ability to crit. Now, granted, they applied this to all offensive traits in the game. Every damaging proc on every class received the same treatment. However, no other class outside of Necro really depended on such damaging procs, except possibly Hammerguard, but Hammerguard kind of had a nerf coming, given that they would literally one-shot people on Alpha. Now, I can, on some level, understand why ArenaNet's making these changes. I've discussed in the past, particularly in my video about Condi Thief, the design problems inherent to offensive procs, particularly ones that occur on strike, such as Chill of Death and Chilling Nova. Traits like that, since they only occur on strike, or specifically a successful strike, they're not traits that you can counter. There's no way to avoid them. The moment you get hit, they go off, so you just can never get hit if you want to avoid those procs. So I can understand in that regard why ArenaNet would want to cut them down. What I don't understand is why they went after traits like Weakening Shroud and Spiteful Spirit. These aren't random procs. They're actively controlled things. They form the backbone of Necromancer's ability to deal with highly evasive classes. And realistically, it's just too much. Like, our offensive capability was really hit hard, at least for Power Necro. Condi Scourge, it doesn't matter because Condi Scourge didn't use any of these procs. But for Power Necro, the changes to particularly Spiteful Spirit and Chill of Death are pretty substantial. In fact, I'm not even sure Chill of Death is worth taking. It may be worth taking the Might trait over Chill of Death. I'm still playing with them, though. The big value for Chill of Death, even post-nerf, is that it applies Chill for 6 seconds when it goes off, in addition to its Boon Rip, which is the longest duration chill we have available to us. So it's still kind of a hard sell to get rid of it, since it does give you that chill, and through that chill the vulnerability and also the 10% damage modifier that we get out of Reaper's Minor. So there's still a very good case for using Chill of Death, although again the Might trait does look a lot more appealing in Spite now, particularly against Mesmers, because against Mesmers Chill of Death wasn't particularly good anyways, because it would often proc against their clones. So depending on the matchup of the enemy team, you would definitely consider taking the Might trait if they've got a lot of Mesmers. Moving on, there really weren't any other major changes. They made some changes to Abrasive Grit and a couple minion traits. These don't really matter much at all for PvP. The Abrasive Grit change was basically just undoing the hotfix nerf they did when they put out Sanctuary Rune, which turned out to be broken with Abrasive Grit. They changed it so that it only activates from Necro skills and not from runes. Overall, this patch is a net nerf to Power Reaper. In particular, Spectral Onslaught Reaper was hit the hardest. Now, I was never particularly fond of Spectral Onslaught Reaper. I never ran it. I didn't find it competitive. I never understood why other people like it. But again, other people swore by the build, and I know there's a lot of Necromancer mains that are really agitated at the changes in this patch, particularly those made to Soul Reaping. Mostly for me, I'm just agitated at the nerfs to the procs because it makes a lot of our matchups much more difficult. However, it's not the end of the world. My Aristocracy build that I showed in my last video still performs very well, even with the proc nerfs. On the other hand, other classes were given nerfs. In fact, pretty much every class got some nerf or another, so we're not the only class that was put on the chopping block. Although I will say we were probably hit the hardest, at least Power Reaper was. If you're playing ranked, you're probably going to want to be playing Scourge nowadays. In fact, I've pretty much seen no other Reapers in ranked since this patch came out. I've still been playing Reaper using the Aristocracy build that I will continue to use for the time being, because it does get really good results, although I haven't seen anyone else using it, so I guess no one else agrees with me on that